directly involved in the society of his time. And the society of his time is very similar from various viewpoints to the society in which we live today. At least that is something that the Islamists have got right when they say that indeed this society, the world, the geopolitical situation of the world today can somehow be compared to the geopolitical situation at the beginning of the 14th century, when you have the Mongols ruling Iran and Central Asia and threatening the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, invading Syria in 1299-1300, then converting to Shiism around 1306 with Uljai II, and then threatening again to invade Syria and Egypt around 1310. And it is under that threat of a world power that is threatening the Muslim world in its existence that indeed Ibn Taymiyah operates. The Crusaders are over. They came to an end in 1291, and they were not that important. They didn't threaten the Muslim world in its existence. The Mongols did. But then the Mongols converted to Islam. In 1295, Ghazan, the Ilkhan ruler of Iran, converts to Islam. But he still wants to destroy the Mamluk Sultanate. So what do we do in Syria when we have those new Muslim rulers in the east still threatening to invade this traditionally Muslim country, Syria and Egypt? Ibn Taymiyah will propose a theology of war. He will start saying that they are not real Muslims. They converted, but in fact they are still ruling on the basis of the great law of Genghis Khan, the Yasa or Yasaq, and not on the basis of the Sharia. So they are not real Muslims, and so we should fight them. And those three anti-Mongol fatwas that were written by Ibn Taymiyah at the beginning of the 14th century have become in the 20th century probably the most widely read text by Ibn Taymiyah among Muslim extremists and terrorists. You find those anti-Mongol fatwas quoted by Abdessalam Faraj in Egypt, the electrician who is behind the assassination of President Sadat in 1981. You find those three anti-Mongol fatwas quoted in Algeria by Ali Belhaj, the number 2 of the Islamic Salvation Front in the 1980s, 1990s, during the civil war in Algeria. You find them quoted by Osama bin Laden. So they are a very widely read text, but they are totally misunderstood, because Ibn Taymiyah developed this takfir theology against an invader that had turned towards Shiism, that was famous for the massacres it had committed in Damascus in 1299 and in 1300 while it was occupying Damascus. As for Ibn Taymiyah's relation to the Mamluks, and the Mamluks were, as you know, ethnically also from Central Asia for most of them. They were also Turks or Tatars who had been given a bit of Islam and a bit of Arabic when they were given power in Egypt. But they were not that more faithful to the Sharia than the Mongols themselves. But towards them, Ibn Taymiyah was always faithful, even when they were putting him in jail. The young Sultan Nasser Muhammad, son of Qalawun, under whom he lived, he calls in some work the renovator of the religion in his time, Mujaddid ad-Din, or Muhyi ad-Din. renovator of the religion. So he's totally loyal. So when you read Osama bin Laden, Ali Belhaj, or Abdeslam Faraj, you see that they say, for example, to Sadat or to the Algerian generals, you do not rule according to the Sharia. You rule on the basis of foreign laws, inherited from French colonization in Algeria, or imposed by America and leading you to go to Jerusalem in the case of Sadat. So you do not rule on the basis of the Sharia, but you rule on the basis of imported other laws. So you are not a Muslim. So we have to fight you. So that's what I've called Mongolizing Islamism, because it's an Islamism that assimilates the rulers of Muslim countries to the Mongol invaders. It Mongolizes them. But it's a misreading of Ibn Taymiyah. Ibn Taymiyah was always loyal towards his own Mamluk rulers, because that's one of the basic principles of the Sharia, which is not specific to Ibn Taymiyah, particular to him, but which you find among all the different schools. You cannot rebel, you cannot take arms against your own rulers. Why? Because the companions pledged allegiance to the Prophet on the basis of 3 engagements. We will obey. We like it or we do not like it. We will obey. We will not dispute the authority of those who exert it. But we will say the truth, or we will stand up for the truth without fearing being blamed by anybody. But there is a difference between opening your big mouth and taking your Kalashnikov and killing Sadat or starting a civil war. Ibn Taymiyah was never in favor of any kind of tyrannicide. And those Islamists who in the 20th century have assimilated the rulers of Muslim countries to the Mongols using the anti-Mongol fatwas of Ibn Taymiyah have basically made a confusion between external policy and internal policy. They've considered the kind of theology he had developed in a fatwa for a very particular reason, to mobilize Syria against the invaders. They've considered that it was the basis for his relation with his own rulers, and that those texts could indeed be used today to dispute the Islamic character of the rulers of Muslim countries. That was Mongolizing Islamism. Supposedly, Ibn Taymiyah was condoning tyrannicide. In fact, he was not. He was condoning, yes, resistance against invaders, but he always kept totally loyal to the Mamluks, his own rulers. And he's very clear. He says 60 years of an unjust, despotic ruler or imam are better than a night without imam. It's the most traditional loyalist approach that you have in Ibn Taymiyah as you have in generally the other classical thinkers of Islam. Because when you start civil war, you know where it starts, you don't know how it ends. And very often, he explains, you think that by starting fighting a ruler, you will be able to correct the evils that you are refusing in those rulers. But in fact, the harm that you are going to do by taking arms against those rulers is much bigger than the evils that you are trying to correct. And he will say, and you can read it in the book among other statements, he will say that you can even start any kind of crusade, let's use that terminology, any kind of moral crusade if there is no chance of success. If the expected collateral damage is worse than the harm you are trying to find a solution to. For everything you need tadabbur. You need to go for the lesser evil. And lesser evil sometimes means being patient. And he is very clear. He speaks then in an autobiographical way, and he says, if indeed you are forced by a ruler, by a power, to change your views on the religion, and you accept to do so, then you are not faithful to the religion. But if refusing to share the views of the power leads the power to jail you, to harm you, to beat you, to imprison you, فَهَذَا سُنَّةِ اللَّهِ أَنْبِيَائِهِ وَالَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُمْ. That's the way God deals with his prophets and those who follow them. So you have this so-called father of the Islamic Revolution, or spiritual ancestor of Islamism, that says, if indeed you are forced to change your ideas and you do not accept that, and you are then harmed for your ideas, and you are in prison and you are jailed, and even if you are killed, that's the way God deals with his prophets and those who follow them, and that's the way you should go. It's very clear. You have, from this point of view, rather than condoning tyrannicide, you have all the texts you need in Ibn Taymiyah for civil disobedience and accepting martyrdom in defense of your ideas. It's not taking your Kalashnikov. It is accepting to die. And he goes further and he says, and those ideas are not specific to him. You find them among all the classical, most of the classical thinkers of Islam. And he says, and if you are forced by some system to kill somebody else, but yourself you know that this order is unjust, you have to refuse obeying that order. And if it means that you are going to be killed, so be it. Your life is not worth more than the life of the person that you were asked to kill. So it's not just passive resistance there. It is passive resistance to the point of accepting self-sacrifice. And somehow I was speaking with friends about that, and they were saying, no wonder they don't teach us those texts in Muslim countries very often. That's exactly the kind of text they don't want us to hear about. But those are the texts that you have in this guy who is supposed to be an extremist. That's for the first accusation. The second accusation of Nathana de Longbas is the so-called strict division of the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. It's this accusation which I studied in this book, and in the French version it was called Mardin, because it's a very famous fatwa by Ibn Taymiyah. You know, Mardin is this lovely little city in southeastern Turkey today. In the time of Ibn Taymiyah, it was a little satellite state, the satellite of the Mongol Empire of Iran. The rulers of Mardin were Muslims, but they were part of the Mongol Empire of Iran. Population was mixed, Muslim and non-Muslim. And Ibn Taymiyah is asked, is Mardin part of Dar al-Islam or is it part of Dar al-Harb? Are we allowed to start attacking Mardin? And Ibn Taymiyah answers, Mardin is not part of Dar al-Islam and it's not part of Dar al-Harb. It has a third status, Hukm Thalit Murakkab. It has a composite status, which means that in a very precise case, we have there a text by him showing that already in his time he considers that this strict division of the world into two different spheres is irrelevant. Situations in which he lives are far more complex, and this division is based on the work of some jurists. It's not canonical, and in many places we will have situations that are more complex. And then when you look for other texts about ahkam al-diyar, the status of places, are places part of the Dar al-Islam or part of the Dar al-Harb? Should we fight them, or can we consider them as part of the world of Islam? What does he answer? He says, ahkam al-diyar, the status of places, differ, vary, according to the states of the hearts of the people who live in it. أحكام الديار تتغير بحسب أحوال قلوب سكانها. أحوال قلوب سكانها, the states, the spiritual states of the heart of the people who live in those places. That's what he takes into consideration. And that's a position which has nothing to do with what very often Islamists in the 20th century have said. And in this book, in which I translated and studied Mardin's fatwa, the fatwa of Mardin by Ibn Taymiyah, also looked at a few modern authors to see how they were using it. For example, Muhammad Abdel Salam Faraj, the same Egyptian electrician I've already referred to. But also Abdallah Azzam was the mentor of Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. Also the Sheikh Abdul Aziz al-Jarbour of Saudi Arabia, and two others. And I look at the way they have understood that Mardin fatwa. And it's very funny to see that some of those Islamist thinkers who have great respect for Ibn Taymiyah have even greater difficulties with him about this fatwa, because they can't accept it, because they have a very political understanding of what an Islamic state should be. And they misunderstand what Ibn Taymiyyah says in that Mardin fatwa. Because to justify that Mardin is not part of the Dar al-Islam, he says Mardin has not the status of a Dar al-Islam, because a Dar al-Islam التي يجرى فيها أحكام الإسلام. Dar al-Islam would mean that أحكام الإسلام, the rules of Islam, are implemented in that place. So you look on the CD-ROMs of the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah, and you try to find what he means by Ahkam al-Islam. And for him, Ahkam al-Islam is the right for a Muslim to have his body washed when he dies and to be buried in a Muslim cemetery and similar things. Problem is that all 20th century Islamists consider that Ahkam al-Islam means Hukumat Islamiyah. So they slip from the status, the rules of Islam, towards an Islamic government. And so they have great difficulties, because their understanding is that to have a realm of Islam you need to have an Islamic government. They have great difficulties with those texts of Ibn Taymiyyah, in which Ibn Taymiyyah says that in fact the status of place vary according to the states of the hearts of the people who live in it. It's nothing to do with the political system ruling that place. But we have a politicization of the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah which is totally unfaithful to his understanding. In fact, his understanding of reality, his approach to reality is religious, ethical. It's not really political. But we take politics for granted, as if it was the only window through which to look at reality. We take, for example, the work of Ibn Taymiyah, السياسة الشرعية, to mean a political regime. Siyasa doesn't mean politics. Sas al-ibil means he led the camels to the place where they would drink. It's nothing to do with polis in the Greek sense. So a siyasa shar'iyya is the guidance of the community on the way of the Prophet. That's what more or less it means. In his case, an example he gives to explain what siyasa means, he says it's like a shepherd. A shepherd cannot claim to be a shepherd if he is not followed by his sheep. Similarly, a sa'is or a ra'is cannot claim to develop a siyasa if indeed he is not followed by people. And we have there another approach to politics than what those Islamists and also Orientalists make him say in the 20th century. But to come back to the second accusation by Nathana de Longbas, it's obvious that she didn't read the Mahrdin fatwa. But if she had read the Mahrdin fatwa, it would become very difficult for her to say that for Ibn Taymiyyah the world is indeed divided strictly in those two different spheres. No, the situation is more complex than that. And then the third accusation is that he is some kind of professional mukaffir, calling people unbelievers as soon as they do not share his own ideas. Come on. Have you read his fatwa on the calendar? The calendars are the Sufi hippies of the 14th century, to make it short. They are the guys who do not follow any kind of religious prescription or societal rule. They go around naked, covered with tattoos or piercings, because that shows that they are suffering out of love for the Lord. Not respecting anything, living in cemeteries, shaved completely, even eyebrows and eyelashes. Very, very unconventional, to say the least. And Ibn Taymiyyah is asked, what do we do with those guys? And he starts in his fatwa on the calendars, which is translated in the book here. He starts by saying, yeah, of course, they are not really Muslims. And there are so many like them. But then instead of continuing in that direction, which would lead to the takfir, etc., he says, in fact, if there are so many like them, it's because the ulama, the scholars, are not doing their job properly. It's because we live in a time where the effects of prophethood have cooled down. And in fact, we live in a time which can be illustrated by this hadith, sahih, which I call the hadith of the forefathers. A time will come when we will know nothing anymore of the religion. We will not know prayer, we will not know how to fast, we will not know about pilgrimage, we will not know anything of the religion. We will just remember that our forefathers were saying there is no God but God. Not even that Muhammad is the messenger of God. And some companion said to the Prophet, that will not help them. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, answered 3 times. It will save them from the fire, it will save them from the fire, it will save them from the fire. So just a time will come when people will know nothing of the religion anymore, but only remember that their forefathers were monotheists of some kind, and that will save them from the fire. And instead of pursuing into the takfir, into the anatomization of the calendars, Ibn Taymiyyah prefers to go that way, and saying, in fact, if you have new converts to Islam who are not practicing the religion properly, if you have people who were born far away in the steppe, like the Mongols, far away from the centers of Islamic knowledge, you cannot call them unbelievers. You have to educate them. And he goes further. And he says, you can never call anybody an unbeliever unless not only you have all the reasons to do so, but also you have answered all the objections against doing so, which is another program. You can have many reasons, you must have all the reasons. But if there is any objection against calling somebody an unbeliever, because he hasn't got the required education, because he is new in the faith, because he is going through bad times, because, and you can add all the circumstances that should be taken into account, you cannot condemn him in any way. And we have there, in that fatwa, on the calendars, a treatise on tolerance. And in fact, the final position of Ibn Taymiyyah on this question is exactly the same that you have in Al-Ghazali. If you read, for example, the Faisal al-Tafriqa by Al-Ghazali, who dies in 1111, and is translated into English, the limits of boundaries by Chairman Jackson, Al-Ghazali says, Inna takfir fi khata, amma sukut fala khatara fi. In calling somebody an unbeliever, there is a risk, there is a danger. In keeping silent, there is none. And that's, in fact, is also the position of Ibn Taymiyyah.
Who advocated the use of force against non-Muslim rulers.
So that's a question. It's a question of jihad. Independently of the spiritual aspects of jihad, which I will come to in a minute, Ibn Taymiyyah is utilitarian. He's a pragmatist. You cannot start any kind of jihad if there is no chance to win it. Okay? You cannot go into any kind of armed conflict if you are just a little group, because it doesn't make sense. So those are just practical reasons. And then when we go for more spiritual ones, the hadith it refers about jihad is the hadith authentic, unlike the one of the lesser and the greater jihad, which is not authentic. It's the hadith which says, Afdalul jihad kalimat haq amam sultan jari. The most eminent jihad is to speak the truth in front of a despotic sultan. Kalimat haq. So that's what he calls the greatest jihad. And then he doesn't deny that, and it would be not honest for Muslims to deny it, that like other religious or ideological communities or societies, we believe that there are some values that at some point, if all other means have been exhausted, deserve to be defended by the use of force, if all other options have failed, okay, and in different cases. And he looks at jihad as a continuum. And he says, in fact, we have to start with tawbah, repenting, because that's jihad and nafs. It's fighting against our own sins. That's what we have to start doing. And from tawbah, we can go to hijrah. Hijrah as fleeing away from our own sins and fleeing away from sinners, putting some distance between them and us. And if indeed we are able to do so, perhaps correcting them, and then from Tawbah we go to Hijra, and from Hijra we go to Amr bil Ma'ruf, wa Nahi anil Munkar, commending good and forbidding evil. With our heart, with our tongue, or with our hand. And then that can lead as a continuum, as a long spectrum towards jihad in a military sense. But you have had to go through all this spectrum first before reaching that option. And then he says, if you go for jihad for any other reason than i'la kalimatillah, to make the word of God the most important, the highest, this is not jihad. If you go for jihad because you are angry, that's not jihad. If you go for jihad because of any kind of emotional reason, that's not jihad. If you go for jihad because of any kind of material reason, that's not jihad. So, before going into jihad, after looking at all the practical reasons and looking at the spiritual aspects of it, I think that there are many, many things that any kind of Muslim who would think about jihad would have to deal with before going into that kind of behavior. I remember while I was living in Oxford, I had at some point access at some documents of the British anti-terrorist police. They asked me to look at some documents. They were in fact transcripts of conversations in a terrorist cell that had been bugged. I looked at it as if they were medieval documents. They wanted a report on that. You can find it on internet. You type on Google Michaud report, the lawyer of those guys put it on internet. And they asked me for a report. And those conversations were very interesting because the guru, the cell leader, who was trying to transform his followers into some kind of Muslim Schwarzeneggers to send them to Afghanistan, supposedly, was always complaining that they would come late to the meetings. And so he would say, you should realize that if you want to be a mujahid, first you should come on time. Because the etiquette is part of jihad. The adab is part of jihad, and you have to start with that. At least there he was right. At least there he was right. But some of his followers were also right, because when he was telling them, we are going to go for some jogging with 15 kilos on our back and try to be serious, not 5 kilos like last time, make it seriously. You read in the transcript, someone must raise his finger and say, can't we go fishing instead? And so they are not interested in jihad, they just want some collective entertainment for young Muslim males between 20 and 30. So, but you can read the report on the internet if you're interested. It shows you that jihad is a serious thing. It's not just because you are angry, because there is some injustice, going, killing everybody. That's not jihad. That's dealing in a bad way with your own psychological problems. To come back, even taymiyah taking part in jihad, yes. While the Mongols are occupying Damascus without taking the citadel after their victory at Wadi al-Khazinda at the end of 1299, so they are for a few months occupying Damascus, but not the citadel, which they cannot take. Ibn Taymiyyah is the heart of the Damascene resistance against the invader and the occupant. He is famous for having gone to Razan, who is camping outside of the city. That's where he will meet not only Razan, but his famous vizier, the Ilkhanid historian Rashiduddin Fazlallah al-Hamadani. and also different Mughal commanders. He will obtain the liberation of their Muslim and non-Muslim prisoners. And it's a famous episode. If you look at the Musalsala that has been produced, I think by the Qatari TV or some other Gulf state about the life of Ibn Taymiyah, it's a totally stupid thing that they have done. They show Ibn Taymiyah speaking to the Mongol occupier of Damascus, and the Mongol ask him, and why do you want me to release the Ahl Zimma, the Zimmis, not only the Muslims? And Ibn Taymiyah is made to answer, oh, لأنهم من أهل وطننا, because they are people of our own country, they are compatriots. It's stupid. We have the text by himself in which he says, yes, I said, because لأنهم من أهل ذمتنا, because they are people under our protection. But you see, Arab modern nationalism even switches the historical reality from religious answer, which makes sense, to a nationalistic modern one, which doesn't make sense. And then the second time he directly took arm was for the Battle of Shakhab in 1302, when the Mongols come back and this time will be defeated. And Ibn Taymiyah is famous then for having given the permission for the Muslim Mamluks not to fast, because the battle was taking place during Ramadan, and he said in a fatwa, eat properly, drink properly, and you'll do another day of fasting later, but you need to be strong for the battle. And he was on the battlefield himself. So those two moments and resistance in Damascus and then his participation in that battle are famous. What do we do with correct to try to improve government? We open our big mouth. From this point of view, the difference between the way Egyptians got rid of Sadat and got rid of Mubarak is fantastic. It seems that in 30 years they have gone from a kind of revolution that was very similar to French or Russian revolutions to what an Islamic revolution is, which is you open your big mouth, you demonstrate, you get killed if necessary, but you do not take up arms against your own rulers. And when you compare the end of Sadat, who was killed, assassinated, and the end of Mubarak, there is a big improvement in the Islamization of Egyptian societies and their understanding of political Islam. And this time it seems to have worked. Let's hope so. Dar al-Harb and waging, I would go there from Ibn Taymiyah to one of his best modern scholars, which is Sheikh Qaradawi. Sheikh Qaradawi, who says, what sense does it make to call to war against some enemy when you have to buy your weapons from that enemy? It doesn't make sense. And so that's a pragmatic reason, among others. And it's surely not some groups that have the authority to call for jihad. In his case, at the beginning of the 14th century, he believes in some kind of cooperation between the fuqaha or the ulama and the umara, the emirs. But he reminds the emirs that they in fact have no other authority than the authority which is recognized to them by the people. And he says you cannot claim to be an imam if there is nobody praying behind you. You cannot claim to be in charge as a ruler if nobody follows you. So you better develop some kind of cooperation with your so-called subjects. And at the end of the day, it must be a collective decision. And this collective decision, although it can be led or implemented by the emirs, will always have to be also based on the fact that an emir is nothing without the people who have recognized to him the power that he is exerting upon them. And that's why, that's another famous formula, at some point he says, you are not an emir, you are an ajir, which means you get a salary from me. That's what it considers an emir is. An emir has no divine power to rule, he is just under contract with the community, and that's how the relation should be between the emir and the people who are more commanded by him. And so the decision to go into jihad will have to be taken by the authorities, but if the authorities are not followed by the people, all that, we have taken for granted that political Islam, as was developed during the 20th century, was faithful to Islam, or faithful to even taymiyah, among other things. I think that there is a lot of text that should also be taken into consideration. And I have alluded to some, but you have within not only an empowerment of the community, but also an empowerment of individuals. Because on the last day, it is individuals who will meet their Lord. It's not a government, it's just everybody. And again, those are texts that he writes in the Minhaj as-Sunnah against the absolutism of the Mongols. He says, just remember the Prophet, peace be upon him. We have this, he is the last Prophet, he is the Sayyid al-Bashar, he is the master of humans, and he is told by his Lord to be good and not to be to have a hard with them, because they would go away from him if he's too hard with them. And himself then says, you take me for an arbitration, one of the two of you is more eloquent than the other, and I might give a right to one of you who doesn't deserve it, but he has been more eloquent than the other. So if that is the case, let him know that I have given him nothing else but a part of the fire of Jahannam. Which means that instead of imposing his authority, he is asking us at the last, at the end of the day, to use our own judgment and the purity of our heart. Every order, every decision that we are submitted to cannot be implemented automatically. It must transit through our own pure heart and purity of intention, because it is not the authority that will be judged, it is us. And there can't be any obedience to a creature while disobeying God. If that is not a very modern type empowerment of individual conscience, I don't know what it is. But it goes in parallel with a disempowerment of authorities. And then I don't know how you can have some kind of Islamic government that would impose a particular reading of the religion. He says, very interestingly, look, rulers are obliged by Islam to protect the non-Muslim minorities, the Ahl Dhimma. It is one of the duties of Muslim rulers to protect those non-Muslim communities living among them. So even more so, it is one of the duties of the rulers to protect Muslims from each other by making sure that diversity of opinion is implemented. No Muslim group having any kind of right to impose its views on the others. And the rulers, instead of imposing his own reading of the religion, has got to impose the respect of diversity of opinions.
Where does he say this? So Ibn Taymiyyah writes this?
Yeah.
Where?
I can give you my French translation. It's going to be published. But I think it's in the Minhaj soon. No. That one is in the Majmu' al-Fatawa. It's the text he writes in jail during the last 2 years of his life. Okay. First, about Ali. I'm not a specialist of the criticism of hadith, but his main position is that the tartib al-fadl, the hierarchy of eminence of the four well-guided caliphs corresponds to the historical order of succession. So the most eminent for him is Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Uthman, then Ali. That is for him very clear. So the order of succession corresponds to the order of eminence. And that's the main principle, and it's perhaps on that basis then that he will question the authenticity of a few hadiths. For example, the so-called appointment in Khadir Khom, etc. He will have to say, no, they are not authentic, or he doesn't accept the isnad, but I haven't studied that in particular. So about his Sufism, that's much clearer. He has the greatest respect for al-Jilani, yes. He comments on the Futuh al-Ghaib of al-Jilani. He has a difficulty about al-Hallaj, because, you know, al-Hallaj, who was executed in 922, al-Jilani said, al-Qatil mujtahid wal-Maqtul shahid. The one who executed al-Hallaj was Mujahid and Mujtahid, and the victim was a martyr. Ibn Taymiyyah has a difficulty with that, especially as it is coming from al-Jilani. He has also difficulty with al-Jilani saying, if I had been there, I would have helped al-Hallaj and he would not have slipped. So, his love for Abdul Qadir is not unconditional. It is informed, it is great, but it's not unconditional. In fact, his somehow unconditional respect is for the early Sufis, pre-Bastami, pre-Junaid, those that we have somehow very little literature about, like Bishr Hafi, Sarid Saqati, and all those very first and second century ascetics. Those he has the greatest respect for. Was he himself a Qadiri affiliated to a tariqah as a Maqdisi as claimed? Not everybody agrees with Maqdisi's argument. What I find far more interesting is what himself says about tasting the sweetness of the faith. And you have a language which is of a very high spiritual value when he starts speaking about love of God and being loved by God, and the necessity to taste the sweetness of the faith, not just obeying formally to the prescriptions of the religion. I don't know what Sufism is. I don't know if that is Sufism, but I know that that is very deep spirituality. But the question is indeed, what is Sufism? Because there are so many different dimensions. In his case, I would say the kind of Sufism for him would be, you want to fly high, go deeper into the Sharia. Then you'll fly high.
Oh.